When you spend decades building a life with someone, you never expect them to throw it away for a younger face. At 60, I thought I had seen every kind of heartbreak life could offer. But nothing prepared me for the day my husband packed his bags and walked out the door, straight into the arms of a woman half my age. He thought I'd crumble. He thought he'd humiliate me. But he didn't expect that in the end he'd be the one footing the bill. I still remember the way he said it, as if he were announcing he'd bought a new car or decided to repaint the living room. No hesitation, no apology, just flat, cold words that cut me open. I'm leaving. I found someone else. And after 40 years of marriage, after raising 2 children, after enduring every storm that life threw our way, he thought he could end it like that, in one casual sentence. At first I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Who does that? Who wakes up one morning at 62 and decides to trade a lifetime for a fantasy? But then he said her name. A woman in her 30s, someone from his office, someone who had never scrubbed his dirty laundry, never stayed up with sick children, never budgeted pennies when times were lean. My heart sank. I thought about the family dinners we had shared, the Christmas mornings with wrapping papers scattered around the living room, the anniversaries where he had held my hand and whispered promises I thought were real. Now suddenly it all felt like a script from a play he had abandoned, mid-scene. "You'll be fine," he said, as if I were a piece of furniture that would just keep standing still while he redecorated his life. But I wasn't fine. I was humiliated. My friends whispered, my neighbors looked at me with pity. I couldn't even go to the grocery store without hearing someone murmur, "Did you hear? He left her for that young thing." And I had given him my youth, my body, my best years. I had built his career behind the scenes, keeping our home together while he climbed the ladder. And at 60, when my body ached in the mornings and my reflection reminded me of every sacrifice I'd ever made, he decided I wasn't enough anymore. The first nights alone were the worst. The silence in our bed was unbearable. The empty chair at the breakfast table taunted me. I cried until my pillow was soaked, then got up, washed my face, and cried again. I couldn't understand how a man I had loved for most of my life could so easily discard me. But then something changed. One afternoon, I found an old box of letters in the attic, letters I had written him when we were young, full of hope and dreams. Reading them, I realized something I hadn't seen before. I had always been the one fighting for us. I had always been the one giving, sacrificing, bending, and he had always been taking. That realization burned through my tears and hardened into anger. Not the kind of anger that explodes, but the kind that simmers, steady, deliberate, patient. I wasn't going to beg him to stay. I wasn't going to chase him or try to compete with a younger woman. No, if he wanted to leave, then he would leave. But he was about to learn that walking out on me wouldn't come without a price, because what he had forgotten, in his selfishness, was that everything he had built, all his wealth, his career, his so-called reputation, was tied to me. Every paycheck, every retirement account, every property, we had built those together. And if he wanted to cut me out of his life, I was going to make sure I carved my rightful share out of his. That was the moment the betrayal turned into something else. It became fuel. Fuel for my resolve, fuel for my fight. He thought he could humiliate me by leaving me for someone younger, but he was about to learn that age doesn't make you weak. Sometimes age makes you strong enough to stand taller than you ever have before. That was the beginning of my revenge. The morning after he left, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty coffee pot. His cup was still on the counter, the rim faintly stained the way it always was because he never rinsed properly. For a moment, I thought about leaving it there forever, like some strange memorial to the man who used to share my mornings. But then, with shaking hands, I picked it up and dropped it into the sink. The clink of ceramic against metal felt like a final note at the end of a song. That was when I realized life was not over. Not for me. At first, I had no idea how to begin. The house felt too big. Every corner held a memory of him. The chair by the fireplace where he'd fall asleep watching football. The garage cluttered with his tools. The closet where his suits hung like ghosts. It was suffocating. But slowly, I started making small changes. I donated the clothes he left behind, packed up the pictures that hurt too much to look at, and rearranged the furniture in the living room. I needed to reclaim my space, to remind myself that this was my home too. Friends came by, bringing casseroles and sympathy, their voices full of pity I didn't want. They meant well, but I couldn't stand the way they looked at me, like I was broken, fragile, destined to spend the rest of my life alone. I refused to let his betrayal define me. It was around that time that my daughter sat me down. "Mom," she said gently, "you don't have to go through this by yourself. You need to protect yourself. You need to see a lawyer." I hadn't even thought about divorce yet. The word felt too heavy, too final. For weeks, I'd been drowning in emotions. and it hadn't occurred to me that beyond the heartbreak, there were practical realities to face: finances, property, retirement accounts. That was when Margaret came into my life. She was a divorce attorney recommended by one of my daughter's friends, and from the moment I met her, I felt a strange sense of relief. She wasn't cold or clinical. She was sharp, confident, the kind of woman who looked you in the eye and made you believe you still had power, even when you felt powerless. "You've been married 40 years?" she asked, flipping through her notes. "Yes," I whispered. "And you supported him while he built his career?" I nodded. She looked up at me and smiled. "Then he owes you more than he realizes." For the first time since he'd left, I felt something other than grief. I felt strength. The next weeks were filled with paperwork, meetings, and late-night phone calls with Margaret. She explained everything carefully, making sure I understood exactly what I was entitled to. Half of his retirement, half of his savings, half of the house. I had built that life with him, and I had every right to it. But it wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. It was about standing tall and refusing to let him waltz into the sunset with his young girlfriend, leaving me with nothing but memories. The more I worked with Margaret, the more my confidence grew. I began to walk straighter, to hold my head higher when I went out. People could whisper all they wanted. I knew the truth. I wasn't some discarded wife. I was a woman reclaiming her life. Of course, my husband didn't see it that way. When he got the first notice from my lawyer, he called me, furious. His voice dripped with indignation. "How could you do this to me?" he shouted. I almost laughed. "Do this to you? You left me, remember? This is me protecting myself." There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that told me he had never truly believed I would stand up for myself. That night, I slept better than I had in months. For the first time, I wasn't lying awake replaying the betrayal in my head. Instead, I felt a quiet fire burning inside me, a fire that whispered, "He may have left, but I'm still here. And I'm stronger than he ever imagined." Little by little, I picked up the pieces of my shattered world and began shaping them into something new. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing for the fight of my life, preparing for justice, preparing for the moment when he would finally realize leaving me wasn't the beginning of his freedom. It was the beginning of his downfall. The first time I saw him across the mediation table, he looked different. Not the confident man I once knew, not the husband who had walked out of my life with arrogance in his step. No, this time he looked cornered, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting nervously as Margaret laid out the documents like cards in a poker game. I sat beside her, hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to steady my breath. It wasn't easy, seeing him sitting there so casually with that smug young woman waiting outside in the hallway. I knew she was younger, prettier, with the kind of energy a 60-year-old woman couldn't compete with. But as I sat there watching him squirm under Margaret's calm, cutting words, I realized something important. I didn't have to compete, because I wasn't fighting for his love anymore. I was fighting for my life, my future, and my dignity. Margaret was relentless. She listed everything: our shared accounts, the retirement savings, the equity in the house, even the vacation property he thought I'd forgotten about. Every detail was backed up by evidence, receipts, paperwork. She left no room for him to wiggle free. "Mrs. Thompson is entitled to half," she said firmly, sliding the papers across the table. "And we will pursue spousal support as well. 40 years of marriage cannot simply be erased because Mr. Thompson has decided he prefers a different partner." He scoffed, leaning back in his chair, but I could see the sweat forming at his temple. "She doesn't need all that. She's fine. She has the house, doesn't she?" Margaret's eyes flashed. "Correction, she has half the house. Unless Mr. Thompson intends to buy her out, we will seek sale of the property." That was the first time his confident mask cracked. Over the next several weeks, the battle intensified. Court filings, depositions, endless phone calls. He tried to play the victim, telling anyone who would listen that I was greedy, that I was trying to ruin him. But the truth was simple. I was asking for what was rightfully mine. Nothing more, nothing less. And for every accusation he hurled, Margaret had a counter. "Mrs. Thompson supported you while you pursued your career," she reminded him during one heated exchange. "She raised your children, managed your home, and built the foundation you now stand on. Without her sacrifices, you wouldn't have what you have today. The law recognizes that, even if you don't." Each time she spoke, I felt stronger. Each time she defended me, I felt like I was regaining a piece of myself he had tried to strip away. Of course, he tried to intimidate me. Late-night phone calls, angry texts, even showing up at the house once with that smug girlfriend in the car, watching me through the window as if to rub salt in the wound. But I didn't falter. Not anymore. Every insult, every attempt to shake me only made me firmer in my resolve. The day we went to court, I wore my best navy dress and my mother's pearl necklace. Not to impress him, but to remind myself who I was. A woman of dignity, a woman of strength. I'll never forget the look on his face when the judge read the preliminary ruling. Spousal support granted. Division of assets in progress. Retirement accounts split evenly. He shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white. For years he had held the power. For years I had bent, compromised, sacrificed. But sitting there in that courtroom, I felt the shift. I wasn't powerless anymore. I wasn't invisible. Afterward, Margaret patted my hand. "You're doing well," she said softly. "Just remember, this isn't about revenge. It's about justice." And I nodded, though deep down I knew it was both. Because every dollar he had to hand over, every legal bill he had to pay, every hour he spent stewing in frustration, it was a reminder. A reminder that he couldn't discard me like an old coat and walk away unscathed. And as the legal battle dragged on, I began to notice something else. He looked tired. The girlfriend who had once seemed so smug stopped showing up to hearings. Rumors began trickling back to me, whispers, from mutual acquaintances, that the shine of his new romance was already fading under the weight of his financial troubles. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. But in the quiet of my own heart, I allowed myself a smile. Because for the first time in months, I wasn't the one crying myself to sleep. He was. It's funny how quickly life shifts when the ground beneath someone starts to crumble. For months, he carried himself like he was untouchable, like I was just an obstacle in the rearview mirror of his shiny new life. But the more the divorce dragged on, the more the cracks began to show. At first, it was small things. He called late at night, his voice slurred, muttering about how unfair everything was. I'd hang up, my heart racing, and sit in silence, trying to remind myself that his problems were no longer my problems. Then came the messages through our children, pleading, then demanding, then finally blaming me for everything falling apart. "If your mother wasn't so stubborn," he told them once, "I wouldn't be drowning right now." But I wasn't stubborn. I was steady. I was done being the one who bent until I broke. Word began to spread that his new girlfriend wasn't as enchanted as she once was. She had loved the dinners out, the trips, the gifts, but those were harder to come by when he was writing checks to my attorney and watching his accounts drain faster than he could refill them. A man who once prided himself on providing suddenly looked small, desperate, and less appealing when the credit cards hit their limits. I'll never forget the day my daughter came over with a grin on her face. She sat at my kitchen table, the same spot where I'd once cried over his coffee mug, and said, "Mom, you won't believe this. Dad's girlfriend left him." For a moment, I was stunned. Not because she left, deep down. I always knew she wasn't built for the long haul, but because of what it meant. He had burned his bridge with me, torched the life we built together, and now he stood alone, without the shiny prize he'd abandoned it all for. And that was when the tables truly turned. He began to show up at court looking disheveled. His lawyer, clearly tired of the endless back and forth, looked more like a babysitter than an advocate. The smugness was gone. In its place was something almost pitiful, a man realizing too late that he had gambled everything and lost. But here's the thing, I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. For years, I had sacrificed my own needs for his comfort, my own dreams for his ambitions. When I was the one struggling, when I was the one lonely or tired, he had never once stopped to see me. And when he decided he wanted someone new, he hadn't thought twice about the wreckage he left behind. Why should I feel sorry for him now? I'll tell you when I knew the power had shifted completely. We were in the middle of another mediation session. Margaret, calm as ever, was pressing him about the retirement accounts, making sure every dollar was accounted for. He snapped, slamming his hand on the table, and said, "I can't afford this anymore." Margaret didn't even flinch. She leaned back, her voice cool and firm. "Then perhaps you should have thought about the cost before you walked out of a 40-year marriage." The silence that followed was heavy. He looked at me, his eyes searching for sympathy, for some trace of the woman who used to soothe him when the world was too hard. But I sat still, my face calm, my heart steady. That woman was gone. From then on, everything shifted. He wasn't in control anymore. Every legal bill, every court appearance, every ruling that favored me chipped away at the arrogance he once wore like armor. He used to think he could humiliate me by leaving. Instead, he humiliated himself by underestimating me. And while he spiraled, I rebuilt. I joined a book club. I reconnected with old friends. I started volunteering at the community center. Slowly, the woman I used to be, the one who had dreams and laughter and strength, came back to life. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw less of the abandoned wife and more of the woman who had survived, who had endured, who had reclaimed her voice. He had taken so much from me when he left. But in the end, he gave me something back without even realizing it. Freedom. And freedom, I learned, is priceless. There's a moment in every storm when the thunder quiets, the clouds begin to break, and you realize the worst is past. For me, that moment came the day the divorce settlement was finalized. I had walked into the courthouse with Margaret by my side, my heart steady, my head high. I had been bracing for this day for months, and still there was a nervous flutter in my chest. After all, 40 years of my life were about to be boiled down to legal terms and signed papers. He was already there when I entered, sitting at the end of the hallway. He looked smaller, not physically, but in spirit. His shoulders hunched, his hair grayer than I remembered, his clothes a little more wrinkled. Even his eyes, once sharp and commanding, seemed dulled by exhaustion. It struck me then, this was not the man who had left me with arrogance in his stride. This was a man broken by his own choices. When we sat before the judge, the terms were read out slowly, deliberately. Half of the retirement savings, mine. Half of the house, mine. Spousal support awarded for the next 10 years. Medical coverage until I qualified for Medicare. And finally, the kicker. He would be responsible for the majority of the legal fees, including mine. I glanced at him only once during the reading, and I caught the exact moment his face fell. His mouth tightened, his fists clenched on the table, and his lawyer leaned over to whisper something that made his jaw twitch. That was the final blow. Not just the money, but the realization that in trying to cast me aside, he had handed me the very tools to rebuild my life. The judge asked if either party had anything further to say. He muttered something about unfairness, but his words carried no weight anymore. They fell flat in the silence of the room, the kind of silence that happens when the truth is obvious to everyone. When the gavel finally struck, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Afterward, as we walked out of the courtroom, he caught up to me. For the first time in decades, his voice cracked when he spoke. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly, almost pleading. "We could have worked something out." I turned to him, calm, steady, no anger left in me. "No," I said, "you could have worked something out before you left. But you made your choice, and now you're paying for it." His eyes dropped, and he didn't speak again. Outside, the sun was shining, the sky a clear blue that felt almost symbolic. Margaret squeezed my hand and said, "You've done well. Now it's time to start living for yourself." And that's exactly what I did. I sold my half of the vacation property and used the money to take a trip I'd always dreamed of, to Italy, where I wandered cobblestone streets and sipped wine in small cafes without anyone telling me I was too old or too boring. I renovated the house, turned the guest room into an art studio, and started painting again, something I hadn't done since I was a young girl. The best part? I no longer lived under the shadow of a man who underestimated me. I had learned that resilience isn't about never breaking, it's about refusing to stay broken. He, on the other hand, moved into a small apartment after selling his share of the house to cover his debts. The young girlfriend who once mocked me was long gone, replaced by whispers of unpaid bills and nights spent alone. But here's the truth. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to rub his failures in his face. Life had already done that for me. The real victory wasn't in what he lost, it was in what I gained. My freedom, my dignity, and a future that finally belonged to me. And in the end, while he paid the price, literally and figuratively, I walked away with something no lawyer, no judge, no settlement could ever put a value on: my peace. Life has a way of teaching lessons louder than words ever could. My husband thought leaving me for someone younger would make him feel alive again. Instead, it left him empty, broke, and alone. And me? I found strength I never knew I had. At 60, I thought my story was ending, but it was only beginning. I learned that betrayal doesn't define you, and neither does age. What defines you is how you rise after the fall, and sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't anger. It's peace, dignity, and the joy of living well.